before history began. You are standing where the world is colder than your freezer on its worst day. The wind does not just cut, it steals. Your eyelashes crisp with frost. Your breath turns to tiny ice shards that cling to your scarf, which, by the way, is made from something that used to be alive and rather hairy. The ground is a hard, endless sheet of snow and a frozen earth, pale under a moon that feels too close. Somewhere far off, a wolf howls, and you cannot tell if it is lonely or it is planning your early retirement from life. You probably will not survive this. But before we begin tonight's story, if you enjoy these calm history stories, please like the video and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your comments mean a lot to us. They help us to keep the work on. Your kind words are the biggest support we can get. Now, dim the lights and let us go back in time together. Your boots crunch across a windswept plain that has no trees. There is no kindly forest to hide in, no bushes to break the wind, just white and more white. Here, survival is a group project. Solo adventurers are basically snow-flavored snacks for the wildlife. That is why, just ahead, you spot the flicker of firelight and the soft silhouette of something strange. Not a tent, not a cave. It is a half-dome. Low to the ground, ribs curve like an animal turned inside out. As you come closer, the scale is unsettling. Those ribs are not wooden beams. Wood is rarer here than a polite mosquito. They are bones. Thick, ridged, ancient bones. Too massive to belong to anything you have ever met. Unless you count museums. A mammoth's leg bones, arched into the shape of a doorway. A ring of huge shoulder blades, leaning together to make walls. And those sweeping arcs, not planks, but tusks, curved like pale moons, locking overhead. This, you realize, is not just shelter. It is a skeleton you can walk inside. The people here move like shadows between fire and frost. They are wrapped in layered hides, stitched with sinew. Their hair iced into little crowns. The fire inside the shelter pops and smokes. Even out here, you can smell the fat burning. That smell is more than dinner. It is insulation. Fat-fed fires cling low, hugging the warmth close to the ground. Historians still argue whether these shelters were permanent homes or seasonal bases. Some think small bands built them to last through many winters, repairing them each year like you would patch a cabin roof. Others imagine them as great ceremonial hubs, built for a season, then abandoned to the snow. You are not here to solve the argument. You are here to keep your toes from falling off. You step inside. Immediately, the wind's knife is gone. The bone walls are packed with animal hides, some stiff from freezing, some softened by grease. The floor is layered with woven grass mats, reindeer skins, and furs so thick they could be confused for small pets. The fire pit at the center glows like the heart of a living thing. Sparks drift up and smack against a hide ceiling, leaving black pinpricks where they land. This place is alive with sound, quiet laughter, the pop of fat in the fire, the muted whistle of wind that still sneaks through tiny seams. Children curl near their mothers, their cheeks red from cold, but already shiny with grease to protect them from frostbite. A hunter still smelling of outside, pulls off a fur hood, shakes snow like a dog. He is carrying something in his mittened hand, a tool made from a mammoth rib, sharpened to slice meat or carve more bones. Here is your quirky fact for the night. Some archaeologists believe certain bones in these shelters were chosen not just for size, but for their shape's aesthetic harmony. In other words, even in a world where your next meal might be a week away, you still care whether your wall looks nice. You crouch by the fire, warming your hands over a cooking pot. It is more like a hide bag filled with water, heated by dropping in fire-warmed stones. Someone offers you a strip of meat, chewy, smoky, and rich enough to stick to your teeth. It is probably mammoth, or bison, or something else with hooves and a bad day. The night outside deepens, but in here, the air is golden with firelight. The bones around you feel less like remains and more like guardians, holding back the cold. You cannot help but wonder if the mammoth is giving you walls, a roof, clothing, tools, and food. Is it more enemy or ancestor? The next morning, the cold greets you like a slap from a frozen glove. You step outside the bone shelter, your breath curling in the air. The world is still a blank page, snow stretching to the horizon, broken only by the bumps and shadows of distant hills. Except there, on the far ridge, a dark, slow-moving mass. At first, you think it's a hill that's decided to go for a stroll. Then you see the shapes within it, huge, shaggy, with curved ivory tusks glinting in the weak sunlight. Mammoths. You might as well call them the supermarkets, clothing stores, and home improvement warehouses of the Ice Age, all rolled into one. One mammoth could feed your whole band for months. Its hide could be cut into shelter coverings, stitched into clothing, or layered into bedding. The bones could become beams for the next hut, sled runners, even windbreak fences. Its tusks could be carved into tools, weapons, or artwork. To see one ambling along out there is to see your survival, if you can get it. But here's the catch. Bringing one down is like asking a moving train to politely stop so you can dismantle it for spare parts. Historians still argue whether mammoths were usually hunted directly, with spears and traps, or scavenged when they died from age, ice, or unlucky accidents. Some think our ancestors drove them into pits or toward cliff edges. Others suspect patience was the real strategy, following herds, waiting for a weak or injured animal, then claiming it before wolves did. Right now, the hunters in your group are getting ready. Spears are checked, tips sharpened with flint, sinew bindings are tightened. You notice something strange. One spear's head isn't stone at all, but bone, shaped and hardened. It's said that mammoth bones, when cured and worked right, can be sharper than you'd expect. A fringe theory even claims some hunters preferred bone-tipped weapons for the spiritual circle of killing mammoth with mammoth. You don't know if it's belief or just good recycling, but the hunter holding it looks like he believes. The plan, as far as you can tell, is to move in low and slow. The group fans out, hides blending with the snowy ground, like a shaggy, four-legged stealth squad. Your breath freezes in your nose. The crunch of snow is the loudest thing you've ever heard, so you try to place your feet where others have stepped. In the distance, one mammoth raises its trunk, tasting the air. You freeze, half from fear, half from the actual temperature. It's here that a thought sneaks in. These aren't just walk-in resources. They're living, thinking creatures. You can see their eyes, deep and watchful. There's something in that gaze that says, they know what you're about. One older hunter beside you mutters under his breath, a word you don't know. Maybe it's a prayer, or an apology, or both. The approach is painfully slow, and the tension is high enough to keep you warm without a coat. Then, movement, a shout. The mammoths trumpet an alarm, the sound so loud it vibrates in your ribs. The herd shifts, heavy feet pounding the snow into clouds. Spears fly, some bounce harmlessly off thick hides. Others stick, but shallow. The real fight is about endurance. Can the hunters keep up long enough for fatigue to do what a spear alone can't? Hours later, you see the end. One mammoth stumbles, then collapses in a spray of frost. It's not quick, and it's not clean, and you don't stay close for the last moments. When it's over, the mood is complicated. There's triumph, yes, but also silence. You understand now why the inside of a bone shelter feels so personal. These animals aren't just prey. They're the very architecture of your life. By the time you return to camp, sleds are groaning under the weight of meat, hide, and bone. Children run to meet the hunters, shouting and laughing. The work begins immediately. Meat sliced and hung, fat stored in hide bags, bones sorted by size and strength. The giant skull is rolled away for later use. You can already imagine it forming the base of a new shelter, with tusks rising like frozen waves. A quirky fact to take with you tonight. Some Ice Age people may have placed certain bones deliberately at the shelter entrance, not just for structure, but as a kind of welcome sign or protective charm. Imagine walking through the jawbones of a mammoth to get to bed every night. That's not subtle decor. It's a statement. You settle by the fire again, your hands warmed by a pot of thick, oily broth. The hunters sit nearby, voices low, telling the story of the chase. Outside, the new pile of bones waits in the snow, ready to become the walls of someone's winter home. By the time the next dawn cracks over the snow, the camp is already alive with the sound of scraping, sawing, and voices muttering through mouthfuls of frozen breath. The fresh mammoth bones lie in heaps, long femurs lined up like white pillars, tusks curling beside them, ribs stacked in neat arcs. You watch as the builders move among them, like carpenters in a lumberyard, except their timber is the remains of something that could once squash you without noticing. Here, bone is brick and tusk is beam. There is no other choice. In this land, wood is rarer than fresh fruit in a vending machine. If you want a roof over your head, you build it out of what you have: animal, snow, and earth. You follow two men dragging a tusk toward the half-finished frame of a new hut. They work together, grunting, pressing the tusk's point into the frozen ground, then leaning it toward the center until its curve meets another tusk rising from the opposite side. The arcs form an arch that's both elegant and unshakably solid. Historians still argue whether these shelters followed a fixed blueprint or whether each group improvised. Some excavations suggest near-perfect circles of bones, as if a master plan had been passed down for generations. Others look more haphazard, like the builders decided close enough and went inside before frostbite claimed their fingers. Today's crew seems to be somewhere in between. Careful, but not obsessive. A group of women and older hunters work on the walls, wedging giant shoulder blades upright in a ring. You kneel beside them, brushing snow off one to see the surface. Smooth in some places, rough in others, with grooves where muscles once clung. They fit together like oversized puzzle pieces, held steady with lashings of sinew and wedges of packed snow. Between the bones, hides will be stretched, fur side in, to trap warmth. The hides are thick, heavy, and greasy enough to make your mittens shine just from touching them. One man is carving a mammoth rib with a flint blade. He's shaping it into a smooth plank. Well, as smooth as frozen bone gets, so it can slot into the roof's inner lining. You're told this helps channel the smoke out through a small vent rather than letting it choke everyone inside. In some shelters, according to a quirky fringe theory, people may have intentionally shaped bone to control airflow and sound, turning the space into a kind of low-tech acoustic chamber. It's not proven, but it makes you imagine Ice Age storytelling with just the right echo. As the frame rises, the builders step back often, squinting at angles, testing the give of lashings. A single misplaced tusk could mean the whole roof caves under snow load. The tusks themselves are astonishing. Up close you see that their surfaces are textured, almost wood grain-like, with faint rings marking years the mammoth lived. You trace your gloved fingers along one, imagining how it once swept the ground for grass. The floor gets attention too. First, a shallow trench is dug where the fire pit will go, lined with thick scapular bones to keep the heat from melting the permafrost too fast. Around it, the ground is leveled and laid with mats of woven reeds. Where those came from, you're not entirely sure. Likely gathered from wetlands far away, bundled and carried here over days of travel. Above that, more layers, reindeer hides, wolf pelts, scraps of fur from smaller game. By the end, it's more comfortable than your first apartment. Midway through the build, the wind picks up, whipping ice crystals into your face. Everyone works faster. A tusk slips in its socket and nearly takes out a builder's knee. The danger is real. These are not lightweight props. Each one could weigh more than a small car door. You step back, shivering, as they wrestle it into place again. By nightfall, the basic skeleton stands proud, a low dome of ivory arcs, ribbed with leg bones and braced with shoulder blades. From outside, it looks like the world's strangest igloo. Inside, with the hides already starting to go up, it feels like stepping into a prehistoric cathedral. The curves of the tusks arching overhead like frozen waves. The air is quieter in here, almost reverent. Historians still debate whether this use of bones was born purely of necessity or if it also carried symbolic weight. Living under the remains of an animal you hunted could have been a way of honoring it, of saying, "You keep us safe even now." You glance up at the tusks meeting above your head and feel, just for a second, like the mammoth is still watching. When the last hide is lashed into place, the builders step back, satisfied. A fire is lit in the center, the smoke curling toward the vent like a tame animal. Shadows dance over the bones, making them seem to flex and shift. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, you could almost forget the cold exists. You duck into the new shelter just as the night rolls in. The contrast is instant. Outside, the wind had teeth. Inside, it is a warm, low hum of life. The air is thick with smoke from the fat-fed fire in the center. It hisses and spits as it burns. You can smell everything at once. Singed hair from a hide being softened, grease melting into the flames, and that particular mammal-like scent that clings to furs no matter how well they're cleaned. The fire's glow paints the walls in shifting gold. You notice how the mammoth bones look different in here. Their pale surfaces drink in the light, giving the whole place an odd cave-like intimacy. You find yourself tracing the curves of a rib, where the smoke has already begun to darken it. Someone coughs in the corner. Apparently, even prehistoric smoke ventilation is hit or miss. Historians still argue whether these shelters were purely functional or also social hubs. After 5 minutes in here, you understand why it might be both. This is not just a place to survive. It is a place to gather, to tell stories, to mend tools, and maybe, if you are lucky, to have a laugh before your fingers freeze off again tomorrow. You edge closer to the fire. You notice an elderly woman working over a pot. It is not made of clay or metal, but of a hide bag propped between stones. She drops in a heated rock with a hiss, and the broth inside trembles. The smell is rich, mammoth fat, roots, maybe a handful of dried berries. A child stirs it with a stick, licking his fingers whenever the adults are not looking. A younger hunter sits cross-legged near the wall, scraping a bone tool with a flint flake. You watch the shavings fall like tiny curls of parchment. Beside him, someone else is repairing a pair of boots. Sealed skin stitched with sinew, fur side in. You can see how every inch of this shelter is a workshop. One corner for tanning hides, another for cutting meat, another where a group of children giggle as they make small bone beads. Here is your quirky tidbit for tonight. Archaeologists have found that in some shelters, certain bones were arranged intentionally to deflect drafts, but also to channel the smoke in looping currents. Some believe this was not just to keep the air breathable, but to cure hides hanging near the roof, turning the entire living space into a slow, smoky drying rack. Multi-purpose interior design, Ice Age edition. The conversation is quiet, almost rhythmic. A few jokes are shared, though they are whispered more than spoken. You catch one about a man whose spear bounced off a mammoth because he threw it like a fishbone. Everyone laughs, but in that way, that lets you know the man is sitting right here. The firelight softens their faces. Lines deepened by wind and sun, eyes reflecting the flicker. Then there is the smell, not just of food, but of the place itself. The grease from cooking has seeped into the hides, the bones, even the hair of everyone here. It is not unpleasant exactly. It is survival's perfume. Step outside for a few hours and you will smell the cold again, the sharp nothingness of frozen air. But here, everything is warm, damp, and full. In the far corner, you notice a little detail. A mammoth skull placed low against the wall, its hollow sockets staring into the room. It is not part of the structure. It is just there, almost like a guest. Some fringe researchers suggest these skulls were kept indoors for symbolic reasons. Maybe to protect the household, maybe to remind everyone where their shelter came from. You are not sure, but sitting here under those watchful eyes, you do feel strangely looked after. The fire dies lower and the shelter seems to shrink. The sounds become softer. Outside, the wind roars, but it is a faraway roar, like the ocean in a shell. People shift into sleeping positions, fur blankets pulled tight, heads resting on rolled hides. A few embers crackle, sending the occasional spark toward the smoke-blackened ceiling. You curl up on your own patch of hide. The warmth of bodies around you is like another kind of wall. The smell of the smoke clings to your clothes, your hair, even your skin. But it is oddly comforting. You realize you are smelling safety, warmth, and the memory of the hunt all at once. And as your eyes start to close, you can still hear the faint, steady breathing of the shelter itself. By the time the pale winter sun crawls across the horizon, you are outside again, your boots crunching over hard-packed snow. The shelter you just slept in looks quiet now. Its hide covering is frozen stiff, smoke vent curling thin ribbons into the still air. But your guide waves you over to something half buried nearby. At first, it is just a low hump in the ground. Then you spot the curve of a tusk, bleached and brittle, peeking through the frost. This is not a living shelter. It is an ancient one, long abandoned. The hides have rotted away, the sinew lashings long gone. What is left is a ghostly ring of bones, their tips poking from the earth like the ribs of a giant buried on its side. You kneel and brush snow from a mammoth scapula, its once smooth surface pitted from centuries of weather. Archaeologists have spent decades uncovering sites like this across Eastern Europe and Siberia. Some of the best preserved examples, like those at Mezherish in Ukraine, still have rings of mammoth jaws, tusks, and shoulder blades marking where walls once stood. Radiocarbon dating puts them at around 15,000 years old. You imagine the people who lived there, huddled just as you did last night, firelight bouncing off ivory walls. But here is where it gets tricky. Historians still argue whether every bone circle is proof of a mammoth-bone hut. Some could be the remains of storage structures, windbreaks, or even ceremonial sites. Without the hides and the living camp to fill in the picture, interpretation gets slippery. One excavation revealed such an enormous pile of bones that early researchers thought it must be the leftovers of a massive feast. Later studies suggested it could just as easily have been construction material for multiple shelters. The myths did not help. In the 19th century, when the first bone hut sites were described to the public, artists eagerly filled in the missing details, drawing cozy domes with tidy tusk arches, neatly lashed ribs, and smiling cave families. The reality was probably messier. Uneven lines, patched hides, and smoke curling through gaps when the wind shifted. A quirky fringe theory you hear from your guide is that some of the more perfect bone rings may have been never covered at all, functioning instead as symbolic houses for spirits or ancestors. The evidence? Certain bone rings contain no hearths, no debris from cooking or tool-making, just the structure itself, as if the builders intended it for someone who did not need dinner. You follow a shallow trench that once led to the hut's entrance. The ground is frozen solid, but you can still see where smaller bones were laid as flooring. Nearby, a cluster of pierced ivory beads lies in the snow, likely part of a necklace, maybe dropped while someone worked inside the shelter. You pick one up. It is surprisingly heavy for its size, the surface still faintly polished from human touch thousands of years ago. The wind rises, and you feel a strange pull, as if the old shelter is watching you. Standing here, you are reminded that these huts were more than just protection from the cold. They were an archive of everything a group could do: hunt, building, decorate, even leave traces that strangers millennia later could stumble over in the snow. Your guide calls you to another site, a short walk away. This one has been partially reconstructed for research. Modern archaeologists have placed original mammoth bones back into the positions they believe they once held. The result is both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The tusks sweep high, framing the entrance like a pale, frozen gateway. Inside, it is empty, echoing. You can almost hear the imagined murmur of voices, the pop of fires, the shuffle of feet on fur-covered floors. Standing there, it is easy to see how myths about these shelters have survived. When all you have are bones in the ground, you fill the silence with stories. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly what the people who lived here hoped you would do. The snow crunches beneath your boots as you leave the reconstructed shelter, but the image of those perfect ivory arches clings to you. They are so orderly, so tidy, so, well, modern looking, and that is the problem. Over the centuries, the reality of mammoth-bone shelters has been nipped, tucked, and polished until it fits the neat pictures in our heads. Back in the 1800s, Victorian illustrators had a knack for making prehistory look like a rough draft of their own living rooms. When word of bone huts spread through Europe, magazines were quick to sketch whole Ice Age neighborhoods. Perfect domes lined up in rows, smoke drifting from every top, children playing outside in the snow, as if hypothermia was not a thing. The people in these images were often drawn as surprisingly clean, and with rather good hair, for folks living without shampoo. Historians still argue whether such depictions were harmless artistic license, or if they skewed how generations thought about Ice Age life. In the 20th century, the myths shifted again. Soviet-era archaeologists, eager to highlight the ingenuity of ancient peoples in their territories, sometimes emphasized the planned community aspect of sites like Medjugorje, They painted pictures of cooperative societies with carefully engineered structures, almost a prehistoric version of a well-organized village. The shelters themselves became symbols of resilience, discipline, and community spirit. Never mind that the evidence also showed plenty of irregular, improvised builds that looked more last-minute camping trip than state-approved housing project. Then came television. Modern documentaries love a good visual, and mammoth-bone shelters are irresistible for set designers. In many recreations, the hides are spotless, the bones gleam white, and the interiors glow with fires that somehow produce zero choking smoke. It is the Ice Age's Instagram filter, presenting a life that is clean, cozy, and only lightly dusted with hardship. A quirky, often overlooked tidbit: some 1970s children's books actually featured mammoth bone huts in the background of cartoon adventures, complete with doors that swung on tusk hinges. No archaeological basis for that at all. But it stuck. If you grew up seeing those pictures, you probably imagined Ice Age homes as rustic winter chalets. And so, the myth outgrew the bones. In reality, some of these shelters were drafty, patched with whatever was handy, and dark except for the flicker of firelight. They were functional above all else. But over time, the human need for a good story and a good picture smoothed out the wrinkles. We like our ancient ancestors to be both heroic and relatable, to have homes we would be willing to Airbnb for a weekend, minus the smell. Still, the truth is no less fascinating. If anything, it is more so. Imagine building an entire winter shelter from the remains of a creature you, or someone in your group, took down. Imagine the skill needed to make bones fit together without collapsing, to anchor them in frozen soil, to insulate with hides and furs so your family could survive nights that froze the rivers solid. The romanticized versions might be misleading, but they are born from a real respect for the feat itself. As you walk on, the wind scatters snow over another ancient bone ring ahead. It is rougher, more jagged than the reconstruction, but your eyes can fill in the missing hides, the glowing fire, the hunched figures inside. You realize that maybe the myths are not so far off, not because they are accurate, but because they carry the spirit of what these shelters meant: safety, ingenuity, a fragile bubble of life in an unforgiving world. Somewhere in the distance, the sky darkens, hinting at another snowstorm. You pull your furs tighter and quicken your pace toward camp, where bone and hide still stand strong against the wind. Whether in neat Victorian sketches, Soviet propaganda posters, or the cold, raw truth beneath your feet. By the time you reach camp, the wind has risen to a steady moan, curling snow into low spirals across the frozen ground. You step back inside the shelter, and the shift is instant. The roar of the outside world dulled to a muffled whisper. The fire is already burning low, casting long shadows across the bones. People are gathered close, and the conversation tonight feels heavier. It is the hunt's shadow that hangs here. You cannot live in a house made from mammoth bones without thinking about what it cost to get them. Every wall Every arching tusk overhead, every hide stitched into a draft stopper came from a creature that once walked the plains outside. For every moment of warmth you feel now, there was a day of cold, sweat, and danger out there. Historians still argue whether these hunts were mostly cooperative, bands coming together for one massive strike, or if small groups relied more on scavenging and opportunism. The truth is probably both. But whichever the case, you realize each mammoth meant risk. Even a single misstep could break a leg, crush a chest, or leave someone too injured to survive the cold. The loss of a skilled hunter was not just personal. It could mean fewer hides, fewer bones, less meat to last the season. You glance around the circle. The hunters sit quietly, some sharpening tools, some staring into the flames. One man's spear has been carefully propped near the wall, its tip still darkened from the last kill. You remember the weight of that hunt, the charging herd, the trumpeting cries, the hours of pursuit. It is easy to admire the shelter's strength when you are warm inside. It is harder to forget the blood and exhaustion that built it. A quirky detail you learn tonight. In some sites, archaeologists have found that the bones of multiple mammoths, sometimes dozens, were used in just one structure. That is a staggering amount of effort and danger condensed into a single living space. The shelter you are sitting in could represent years of hunts, with bones collected and reused long after the original kills. You watch as an older woman ladles broth into a shallow bowl. She pauses before serving, whispering a few words toward the fire. Whether it is thanks to the animal, to the ancestors, or to the spirits of the hunt, you cannot tell. But the tone is soft, almost reverent. The children are quieter tonight too. One boy runs a finger along the ridged surface of a tusk, tracing its long arc upward until it disappears into shadow. Maybe he is imagining his own hunt someday. Or maybe he is wondering if he will live long enough to tell the stories the elders tell. As the wind picks up outside, you feel the shelter flex slightly, the hides tugging against their lashings. It is a reminder that this home, for all its strength, is still fragile. Without new hunts, without the constant cycle of risk and reward, it would collapse back into the snow. Somewhere deep in the bones, you hear the soft creak of the structure settling. It sounds almost like breathing. Maybe it is just the wind. Or maybe, in some strange way, the mammoth still stands here, its body transformed into walls and beams, its spirit circling in the smoke and warmth, keeping you safe for another night. Morning comes slowly in the Ice Age. There is no dramatic sunrise, only a faint gray glow seeping through the seams in the hides. The fire has burned low, leaving only embers. The air inside is heavy with the sense of ash, smoke, and boiled fat. Outside, the world is silent, too cold even for the wind to stir. You step beyond the entrance flap. The ground crunches under your boots. The vast steppe stretches away, broken only by low ridges of snow and the distant shadows of reindeer moving in slow, deliberate lines. Somewhere out there, the next hunt waits. But today, the camp is still. The shelter behind you seems almost unreal in the pale light. Without the movement of people inside, it could be mistaken for some strange natural formation, its curved tusks arching like frozen waves, its pale walls of bone blending into the snow. If you didn't know better, you might think the wind had shaped it, or that it had been here since the world began. Over time, the people who built such shelters would move on. Some bones would be left behind, half buried in melting snow. Others would be carried to new sites, reshaped into tools, or burned when no other fuel remained. Archaeologists thousands of years later would find them piecing together the stories. But to their builders, these were not history. They were simply home, practical, temporary, as essential as a spear or a fire. As the Ice Age began to warm, the herds changed their routes. Mammoths grew scarcer. With them went the bones and hides needed for these great shelters. People adapted, turning to wood, to smaller prey, to new ways of living. The era of bone-built houses faded, not in a single moment of collapse, but in a long, quiet drift into memory. Even so, the bones remain in the earth. Dug up centuries later, they tell of cold nights, warm fires, and the fragile balance between danger and shelter. They remind us that survival was never just about skill. It was about community, endurance, and knowing when to risk everything for a future you might never see. You turn back to the shelter one last time. In the soft morning light, it looks almost alive, its arching tusks like raised arms, its curved walls breathing faint clouds of warmth into the cold. Somewhere inside, the embers still glow, holding the night's heat just a little longer. And then you walk away, into the quiet, carrying the memory of a place built from both death and life. As you rest now, let those stories wrap around you like a hide. Let the winds of 20,000 years ago drift gently across your dreams. And remember, the past is never truly gone. It's just sleeping under the snow.